Hello, everybody. Welcome to Free Eurasia Media. Today, we have a special guest joining us to discuss a critical global issue that has been making headlines for quite some time now, the Russian-Ukrainian war. I'm Ra. I will be your host for this enlightening conversation. Our guest, Ambassador Richard Kauzlarich, is a distinguished expert in international affairs and seasoned diplomat with a wealth of experience and insights. He has served various diplomatic roles and has extensive knowledge about the region. Throughout his career, he has demonstrated a deep commitment for fostering peace, stability, and understanding in some of the most complex regions. We are privileged to have him here to shed light on the complexities of Russia-Ukrainian war. Thank you so much, Ambassador.
Well, thank you for asking me.
Thank you. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine is a deeply rooted issue that has far-reaching implications not only for immediate regions but also for global geopolitics. It's crucial to recognize that this is not just a matter of two nations. It touches on the political, economical factors that have shaped Europe for decades. The purpose of our discussion today is to unravel the layers of this complex war and understand factors driving it, and explore possible avenues for resolution and U.S. national interests. Ambassador Kauzlarich, to set the stage, how would you characterize the ongoing war in Ukraine, and what do you see as underlying geopolitical objectives that are driving Russia's action in this destructive war?
Well, it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy for the people of Ukraine who do not deserve this constant rocket attacks, military action that results in the death of civilians, men, women, and children. So, I mean, on the most basic human level, it is a tragedy. And I think it's very clear that this war is the responsibility of Russia. Now, you can say whether is it Putin, is it the Russian elites, is it something else? But Ukraine is clearly the victim of aggression, and from my personal point of view, that demands a response from the U.S., from the international community, that under normal conditions wouldn't necessarily take place. And by that I mean, strong, consistent supplies of military equipment so that Ukraine can defend itself. I think, I'm not sure what is going through the mind of Vladimir Putin, because ultimately he's the one who has to make a decision. But I think it's clear that Russia has lost the war in terms of any quick military victory, which was their intention at the beginning. I think Ukraine will come out of this stronger, though, with a weakened economy, but they've proven themselves capable of more than just defending themselves, of actually reforming their military according to NATO standards, which will put it in a good position for stronger relations with both NATO and the EU. The last point, I would just echo what you said at the beginning. I mean, the implications for this are more than as important as they are in the neighborhood, with relations with Poland, Moldova, Belarus, all of that coming together. But I think they spread beyond that. They have an impact on relations in Africa and the Middle East because of the Wagner Group's activities, because of energy. It has implications for relations with Iran, given the cooperation that's going on there. And so when we look at from a U.S. perspective, the war in Ukraine, we have to really broaden our aperture of our lens to make sure we're looking at these broader set of issues too. And that's what makes this a geopolitical issue as well. But the starting point is the humanitarian dimension.
Yeah, but that's true that humanitarian impact is huge. There's a lot of refugees that led to Europe. But Ambassador, I want to focus a little bit to a little bit more war and counter-offensive. Just today, we read that Biden administration has asked Congress to provide more than 13 billion in emergency defense aid to Ukraine, an additional 8 billion for humanitarian support through the end of the year. And as a massive influx of cash as the Russian invasion wears on and Ukrainian pushes the counteroffensives against the Kremlin's deeply entrenched forces. Looking ahead, Ambassador Kauzlarich, could you please share your insights on how you anticipate the Ukrainian counteroffensive ends this late summer or early fall? What are some potential scenarios that might shape the course of this crucial phase of the counteroffensive?
Well, I will start out by saying I am not a military expert, so I'm not really in a position to judge on the ground success or failure of military action. So let me say that. I think this is going to be a long set of individual military actions where sometimes there'll be you know gains, sometimes losses for both sides. So I think this is not going to end in the fall. I mean, I just don't see any conditions that are going to lead to that. I think what is the risk if if the fighting continues, then it involves the neighbors. It involves Poland in the first instance. It involves Turkey. It involves countries in the Black Sea. And it involves economics, not just of energy, but food supply. So all of these things are going to be a factor in addition to what goes on the battlefield, if you will. And I think what the administration is trying to do, in particular, rallying international support for Ukraine, is to make sure we don't only focus on supplying military equipment, but recognize that there are humanitarian needs that have to be met immediately. And there's a broader question of reconstruction of Ukraine when, in fact, the fighting stops. So I expect, and this is not going to, this will be controversial in the U.S. Because for obvious reasons, the Republicans will take advantage of anything going on around the world to criticize the Biden administration. But the amounts of money that you cited are substantial. And so the critics will say, what are other countries doing? Are the Ukrainians doing enough themselves, both on the economic front, and part of that is corruption, which is an endemic problem when you get as much resources flowing into a situation like this. And what are countries like Turkey, which are so important for a number of reasons, doing to solidify support for Ukraine, but also support for the free passage of energy and and food through the Black Sea to world markets. So I think that what the Biden administration, I don't have much to criticize the Biden administration about in terms of what it's trying to do, what its long-term objectives are. I mean, there are always questions that you can raise about specific acts, but I think there will be a challenge for the administration to solidify the coalition which still exists among the U.S. and Western European countries in particular. By the way, I'm very surprised it's lasted as long as it did, but that's going to take some effort. But also support in the United States as we move into an election year where domestic politics and foreign policy are going to get pushed together. And the American people who are skeptical at best about international engagement that either requires direct military action or substantial amounts of assistance. They have to be treated with an explanation of what the administration plans to do and why it's necessary to spend these vast amounts of money in support of Ukraine.
Well, sir, you discussed very greatly. Well, you're not expert, you're military expert, but you saw this from diplomatic point of view. One is a diplomatic, probably question for diplomats about NATO. Now I'm turning our attention to NATO and ongoing war that has risen questions about the alliance existence and relevance. Could you elaborate on the implication of the Ukraine war has on NATO's future and its continued relevance in future's geopolitical landscape?
Well, I think Putin must be beside himself, because the very thing that he wanted to prevent, which is greater unity within NATO and new members coming into NATO, has happened because of what he has done in Ukraine. I think it's extraordinarily significant that Finland and Sweden are now NATO members. Look, I remember when I was ambassador in Bosnia, and we had a very large NATO force there as part of the peacekeeping operation. There was a battalion that was called Nordbat, which was Norway is a member of NATO, Sweden and Finland. So you had them already, decades ago participating in NATO operations without membership. Now they're members. And that is, that when you look at a map and see now the boundaries of NATO vis-a-vis Russia in particular, it's not a map that Putin would like to see. Now, the question that just came up in the last NATO summit, and it's not a recent question, because I was involved in 2008 in preparations for the Bucharest summit. But the question of Ukraine membership in NATO, it's a different situation than it was 2008. Nobody wanted new members, particularly members from the former Soviet space, like Ukraine, and Georgia was also in the mix at that time. This time, I think, did they make the right decision to defer Ukrainian membership now? I kind of go back and forth on that. There's one side of my brain that says yes, that probably was a good idea until the war's over. To think about bringing Ukraine in. But the other side of my brain says, now's the time to bring them in. I mean, when you look at the roster of recent members in NATO, I don't know of any single country that is more prepared in terms of operating according to NATO standards and having a defense force that's proved itself capable of dealing with the immediate threat that Russia poses than Ukraine. So here's what I think is going to happen. 2024, not only are we having an election, but we're having the anniversary, 70th, or I lose count of the number, 70th anniversary of the Washington Treaty that established NATO in Washington, as this summit will be. And that is going to be really interesting to see how, because the Ukraine membership in NATO will come up then, and we'll see exactly what happens. So it's an important issue. It's a very live issue. There are differences of views, even among NATO countries, but like I say, it is not 2008 where the United States and one or two other countries were prepared to kind of open the door at some point in the future for Ukraine and Georgian membership. Now I think we're at a point where the door is open. They've shown they can walk through it, be a provider of security as opposed to a consumer of security. And the next summit will be very exciting. Journalists will have a good time.
Right, Ambassador. I think it's 1949 NATO creation, then
Yeah.
5 years. I
Yeah.
think next year, 75 years. That's a
Yeah.
very important milestone in the existence of NATO. And you mentioned, Ambassador, about what Putin likes, what Putin doesn't like. Do you believe that Vladimir Putin aims to reverse past US and NATO victories following the collapse of the Soviet Union and reconstitute, restructure Russia's presence in other former Soviet Union republics besides Ukraine? And what drives his ambitions, according to you, Ambassador? And also, maybe we'll also discuss what other nations deserve to be part of NATO besides Ukraine and Georgia. Maybe you have other thoughts about it.
Yeah. I'm reminded as you pose that question of former Russian Foreign Minister Kauzlarich. And this has been, so I've already shown I can't remember numbers very well. It's been at least 10 years that he appeared, after he's living, as you know, in the US. He appeared at the Atlantic Council. And he gave a very interesting presentation. It was kind of based on the idea that both Russia and the U.S. and the West did not take advantage of the opening that Yeltsin presented to develop a more normal relationship. And he came to Putin in this way in talking about all of this. He said, for Putin, the Cold War never ended. And, we all know, I'm not sure what the exact quote was that Putin made, but something to the effect, the greatest geopolitical disaster in history in the 21st century, or 20th century, was the collapse of the Soviet Union. So you kind of put those two together, and I'm not surprised that what he is doing in Belarus, what I think he's trying to do in South Caucasus, Georgia in particular, but Armenia and Azerbaijan as well. And the idea of somehow reestablishing Russia's position in Central Asia, where China has become more and more a factor, in part because of the economic sanctions levied on Russia. I think he still has in mind, going back to the Soviet Union to use a model. But what I think is different is that he's expended so many resources on the war in Ukraine that he really isn't in a position to offer much other than threats, I guess, to the neighboring countries, to the former states in the Soviet Union. So it's a multi-pronged strategy, but the objective is the same: to reduce ties with the West and increase them with Moscow, up to and including perhaps giving up sovereignty.
Thank you, Ambassador, for these insights. Ambassador, I want to shift our focus beyond the war and also NATO. I want to see how do you perceive the broader implication of this war on democracy, free market, sovereignty, and freedom of many nations in larger Eurasia region, especially in other former USSR countries. So I want to see the Caucasus countries and Central Asia countries, maybe Moldova, and probably Baltic countries. So what do you see? How you see the war's implication on the freedom, free market, and other important values that U.S. Appreciates?
Well, one element of Putin's approach, aside from making war, is to present Russia as kind of an alternative model as a nation, a Christian nation based on family values and all of the things that you kind of hear coming out of Orban in Hungary and unfortunately some politicians in the U.S. So unlike during the Soviet period where you had Soviet communism, which had an ideological foundation, whether you believed it or not. Putin has come, to the war in Ukraine without that basis, simply military force. And as as the war has gone on, and as the reaction of the international community has been around, if you will, the U.S. and the West, and a particular model of support for democracy and observance of human rights, Putin has tried to rally, countries that are not tied to that model, to his model of an autocratic, centrally directed state. And so you see, the efforts with the BRIC nations. You see activities in Africa, in part led by the Wagner military group, and I think that's going to be the next the next battle, if you will, in terms of geopolitics. It's going to be of ideas, and I think we will see on the Russian side kind of an elaboration of this kind of core set of principles, and going to countries like those in Central Asia, where and the Caucasus. And I say this not as a Central Asian expert at all, but it would appear that they would be more susceptible to what Putin is putting forward. Most of them, if not all of them, are part of the CSTO. So there's a military security dimension to it. What I think is going to be important to watch is the economic side. Russia is weaker economically. The energy relationship that it's had in the past, globally, has changed. And while they are still a major producer of oil and gas, their markets aren't there in the same way that they were. And so that affects, as I said earlier, Russia's ability to influence countries, including countries in its neighborhood. And there in the background is China. What is the Chinese position on all of this? Will they try to supplant Russia's economic role in neighboring countries, or even further abroad, seeing China involved in the Balkans and other parts of Africa, obviously, with the Belt and Road Initiative. So I wish there were an easy answer that could tie all of this together, but all of these things, are intersecting with the war on Ukraine, kind of being involved in the middle of all that.
Yeah, Ambassador, my last question is, considering the multi-phase impact of the Ukraine war and its implication, what would you recommend an approach for U.S. diplomats and military leadership to safeguard America's national interest in Eurasia? So I want to see you as a diplomat to young or mid-level diplomatic staff. What do you advise them?
Well, I think we do have to keep human rights at the top of our agenda. And that involves, traditional support for democracy, freedom of expression. That has become even more important today because of the way governments, authoritarian governments, can reach out beyond their borders and try to suppress freedom of expression. So, I think we have to make sure that U.S. diplomats understand what are our principles for American foreign policy. The second thing is that we can't do this by ourselves. This is not an American enterprise in Ukraine. It's not an American enterprise to try to make peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan. It is.
Or maybe Georgia. Maybe Georgia.
Oh, Georgia as well. Yes, obviously. I shouldn't forget that because they are very much part.
There's also Moldova, I believe.
Moldova. Right. So we're going to need help, and that's where the EU, where NATO, and where individual countries in the international community come together. And the third thing I think we have to show is consistency in American foreign policy. Everyone expects, in our 2024 elections, there to be change. I don't know that there'll be change. No one knows if there will be change, but I think for diplomats, they really have to keep their focus on their job of representing U.S. interests, not those of a Republican or a Democrat president, U.S. interests, and making sure those are clearly presented to people around the world. That's what we do as diplomats. That's what we should. That's what we've, in a sense, we've always done in the post-war World War II period, but something that's even more important today.
Well, so thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. This is very valuable insights, and I appreciate this. And I also thank to everybody who watched it. Thank you so much.